Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We have three different institutions that are teaming up to bring you today's webinar. First, of course, is the U.S China Institute. We also have our USC colleagues from the USC Center for Transnational Law and Business. And joining us from the East Coast is Jeremy Waterman, representing the China Center at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to join today's conversation. I'm Clayton Doobie. I'm with the U.S China Institute, and I'll introduce our other speakers in just a moment. But first, a bit of a preamble. Today, we're going to be looking at what's next. What's next in the U.S.-China economic relationship? Now, you folks all know that the overall relationship is in pretty bad shape. We've had diplomatic sparring, very pointed language from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Beijing and from the State Department in Washington, D.C. We've had the two sides close each other's consulates in Houston and in Chengdu. We've also seen the two governments deny visas to journalists for organizations from those countries. Right now, we have no strategic dialogue going on security issues, on environmental concerns, on law, on human rights, on a whole host of areas that are important to the two countries. As it happens, the only area we're talking is in the economic realm. And that part of the relationship has its troubles as well. This continuing conversation on trade and investment comes after 2 years of tariffs and counter tariffs. We did get in January, what seems like ages ago in January, a phase one trade deal. Now, what's going on in the two economies? We know, of course, that China suffered the COVID-19 crisis first and has managed to get out of that containment phase, and its economy has started back. And we expect that China is going to be responsible for much of the global growth in 2020. The United States started to recover in July, and the last quarter statistics show a bit of a V recovery, but with the spike up in COVID-19 cases and perhaps the need for countermeasures, that recovery might run into some trouble. So we've asked our experts today to join us to talk about where are we in the U.S.-China economic relationship. Now, that relationship matters. The two countries are responsible for about a third of global GDP. The two countries are responsible for better than a quarter of global trade. And so our economies matter, the first and second largest economies in the world. So where are we today? And more important, where are we headed? And so our speakers will be discussing the various issues that lie before us, and also look at how a Biden administration or a second Trump administration might proceed. So we'll get started. But first, let me take a moment to introduce our speakers. Our first speaker is Brian Peck. Brian Peck teaches at the USC Gould School of Law, and as I've mentioned, heads the Center for Transnational Law and Business. He has worked on trying to attract Chinese business, Chinese investment here to the state of California. He worked for Governor Brown in the International Economic Development Office there. He has a lot of experience in the trade realm, having served with the U.S. Trade Representative's Office for a number of years, looking at questions like intellectual property, trade with Japan, and this sort of thing. He has deep international business experience, having worked as an executive in Japan for both Japanese firms and foreign firms. He's joined by his associate director at the Center for Transnational Law and Business, Fangfei Dong. And Fangfei first studied at the East China University of Political Science and Law, and then came to the United States. And she has extensive work experience. She's worked as for Underwriter Laboratories, which is, of course, a global firm that certifies the safety of products, their suitability for use as intended, that sort of thing. She's also worked for a Japanese firm as it sought to coordinate with China's Food and Drug Administration to get certified to bring products into China. She has extensive experience in looking at how international business takes place. Our third speaker is Jeremy Waterman. And Jeremy comes to us from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, where he heads the China programs that they have there, including the China Center. He is responsible for the research and advocacy work that the Chamber does in a whole host of realms: innovation, investment, intellectual property, financial services, the whole gamut of economic activity, and corporate governance and social responsibility. He has deep experience in this. Now, it's our pleasure to bring these speakers to you today. Brian spoke for us a couple years ago when we had a program on the trade war, part of a roundtable there. And 4 years ago, Jeremy spoke for us at a conference focusing on China in U.S. policy, a conference that we called the China Card. So let's get started. Brian, please begin.
Thank you very much for that very kind invitation, and greatly appreciate your institute's hosting this event. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. We welcome our audience here and look forward to our discussions about where we are and where we're going with China. I'm going to start off by taking a look at some observations of what a possible Biden administration would do in terms of trade and economic policy in a new administration and how it would be different from the Trump administration. So to start it off, I think a lot of people don't realize that as different as Trump and Biden are overall, when it comes to their objectives with regards to trade policy in general and China in particular, their objectives are actually very similar, in some cases the same. For example, both Biden and Trump believe that economic security is national security. And both Biden and Trump designed focused their trade policy with the interest of the middle class or the blue collar workers at the central point. Both recognize the need to address and counter the challenges that China faces or is bringing about towards U.S. economic growth and security, as well as leadership and innovation. The key difference between Biden and Trump then, when it comes to trade policy and policy towards China, is their approach into achieving their objectives. Biden, of course, takes a much more multilateral approach, including supporting and using multilateral institutions, believing in a multilateral rules-based system for trade, and using institutions such as the WTO. He also believes in building a coalition of like-minded democracies to work together, using both long-established allies and new allies as well, in building a relationship that would counter China's economic rise and its state-run economic model. Trump, on the other hand, as we've learned over the past 3.5 years, takes a much more unilateral go-it-alone approach and has a disdain for multilateral organizations, including the WTO. So you have a very, very basic key difference in the approach in achieving their objectives. But again, the objectives and the policies themselves tend to be very similar indeed. So with that as a backdrop, again, I'd like to share some observations of where Biden would take trade and economic policy with China in a new administration. I think we need to start with two basic premises. First is that Biden's trade policy, at least initially, will be driven by domestic priorities. Obviously, the pandemic is the number one priority, but other key priorities that have a more direct relationship with the future trade and economic policy towards China would be economic recovery, job creation, and climate change. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. The second premise is that Biden has publicly stated that China needs to be dealt with and that the U.S. needs to be tougher on China, and that China needs to be held accountable for its unfair trading practices. He specifically singled out industrial subsidies, in particular to its state-owned enterprises. He's also called out China on IP and technology theft. And so, you have that basic premise that he's going to come into office realizing that we need to be tough on China, he just disagrees with Trump's process in doing so. So again, with these two basic premises in mind, I think you'll see the Trump administration design its trade policy and economic policy towards China, at least initially, with the three domestic priorities in mind: economic recovery, job creation, and climate change. But he'll combine that with a multilateral approach in efforts to address the challenges and unfair trade practices that China poses. Biden has criticized Trump's unilateral approach. He believes that Trump's ill-advised trade wars and the unilateral trade tariffs have created havoc to the global economic system. It's hurt U.S. consumers and companies, and is leading on to a dangerous slippery slope of protectionism that could lead to further economic repression or recession in an already depressed global economy due to the COVID pandemic. Instead of a unilateral approach in dealing with China, Biden has actually proposed calling a coalition of like-minded democracies to come together. So in his words, China can't ignore it anymore or afford to ignore it. Along those lines, Biden has called for bringing together and saying that the only way that the United States and the Western democracies can meet the challenge being posed by China is to come together and join forces. For one, bring together over half the global economy, and then thus creating more leverage that China cannot ignore, and would allow the U.S. to have much more leverage in determining new rules to address the unfair trade practices and some of the distortions of the state-run economic model of China. In terms of Biden implementing his multilateral approach, as I mentioned, he's going to call together, or he plans to call together, like-minded democracies to reestablish and repair damaged relationships with key allies such as the EU, Japan, in the region, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. He's going to look to build up new and strengthen new partnerships with newer allies such as India, Indonesia, Vietnam, other ASEAN countries, other Asian democracies. I also believe that the Biden administration would give serious consideration to joining the CPTPP, the former TPP, although he has publicly called that some provisions would have to be renegotiated. At the same time, given that Biden was part of the Obama administration that negotiated and promoted the TPP, and given that the CPTPP gives a multilateral platform for the U.S. to work with like-minded partners, economic and geopolitical, in the Asia-Pacific region to counter China's rise in that region, I think, again, that the Biden administration would give very serious consideration, would very likely rejoin the CPTPP.
Brian, I apologize for the interruption.
Sure.
Not everybody is as conversant with some of the acronyms as you are.
I'm sorry.
Spell out Trans-Pacific Partnership and the like.
Sure. So yeah, the TPP, of course, was a Trans-Pacific Partnership that the United States was part of, and then that Trump rescinded its entry into force when he first became president. The CPTPP is the successor of the TPP. It's the Comprehensive Promotion of Trade and Promotion Authority. And that's the existing agreement with the remaining 11 countries in the Asia-Pacific region that were the original part of the TPP. So thanks, Clay, for bringing that to my attention. Appreciate that. In terms of other multilateral organizations or platforms, Biden has, throughout his political career, been a very strong supporter of multilateral international institutions, and including the WTO. So I think you're going to see the Biden administration re-engaging the U.S. in the WTO, both in supporting it and providing leadership for the necessary reforms that everyone recognizes are necessary for the WTO to become more effective in regulating global trade, in establishing new rules that can meet and address some of the trade distortive measures of the Chinese economic model. I think you're going to see the WTO being reinvigorated by U.S. participation, and that the U.S. would use, for example, the dispute settlement system after allowing the appellate judges to be reformed and the appellate body to be reformed. I think you'll see the Biden administration take that as one of its initial moves. They will file new cases against China, one to utilize the WTO multilateral system, but also to reinforce the importance of having multilateral rules as a government-based system for international trade. I also think you'll see the U.S., as I say, exercising leadership in working with other countries of the WTO to establish and create new rules that, again, address some of the unfair trade practices that currently aren't adequately addressed by WTO rules. Another aspect that will have impact on the U.S. China economic relationship is the shift from global supply and production chains from China back to the U.S. Along those lines, you have two areas where the Biden administration would be, I think, although Trump certainly has his Made in America policy, and as Fangfei will talk about, it tends to be a little more political, I think, rather than the Biden administration would be. The Biden administration has a Made in America policy proposal that would basically have the federal government spend over $400 billion over a course of 4 years to purchase materials and services that are made in the U.S. It would also call for the federal government to invest at least $300 billion in U.S.-based R&D in areas such as electrical vehicles, artificial intelligence, clean tech, again, areas that the U.S. is currently confronting China, and is trying to establish global leadership in that. It would also penalize U.S. companies that manufacture overseas that then import their products back into the United States. This is a proposal that the Biden administration has carried forward, and if it comes into office, I think would certainly pursue to help, again, be in line with those domestic priorities of economic recovery and creating more jobs. In addition, I think the Biden administration would utilize the USMCA, which came into force earlier this year, and its greater integration of the three North American markets, the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, to incentivize supply and production chain vendors to come back to, if not the U.S., at least the North America region, and again, creating more jobs, revitalizing the economy, and fulfilling some of the trade priorities of the Biden administration. With regard to technology, again, we're all familiar with the tech Cold War that we've come into now, the combating, to take the long-term innovative lead in key sectors and key technologies for the 21st century. I think Biden recognizes the challenges that China poses in this area. I think he would take, again, both a domestic and a multilateral approach in addressing and meeting China's challenges to U.S. supremacy in these key innovative areas. On the domestic side, Biden has stated that investment in U.S.-based R&D would be a cornerstone of his presidency to ensure that the U.S. remains a leader in innovation, and then make sure that the U.S. does not fall behind China in areas, again, like IE, clean tech, 5G, high-speed rail, and so forth like that, those areas. So domestically, you'll see greater investment in R&D than you could see in the Trump administration. On the multilateral level, he would be working closely, again, with like-minded partners to establish new rules and standards for key new technologies, for example, 5G. That would establish rules governing areas like AI, IP, secure private sector-led 5G networks, and other key technologies for this century. So as I've mentioned, you've got kind of a combination of a policy of what I call confrontation, competition, and collaboration. We're going to see the Biden administration take a multilateral approach to confront China on its unfair trade practices and the distortive results of its state-run economic model. You're going to see that Biden will compete with China domestically by investing in R&D, in having policies to reshore supply and production chains back to the U.S., or at least the North American region. But I also think you're going to see that when he can, Biden will try to include and collaborate with China on areas of common interest, areas such as climate change, general global health security, non-proliferation, the denuclearization of North Korea. I think that, again, these would be areas where he would work together with China that would be to the benefit of the United States, again, would be in line with the domestic priorities, as I mentioned before. For example, with climate change, not only would be one of the key priorities for the Biden administration in general, but also would help with economic recovery and job creation because of the new jobs and businesses that would be created out of the clean tech sector to implement the climate change initiatives. So I think this concept of competition, confrontation, and collaboration could be an important element, or would be an important element of Biden's China policy, because rivalries and competition can be tempered by mutual interests. So just a couple X factors for a Biden administration trade policy with China. It's interesting to note that as with the Biden administration, obviously you would have Vice President Harris. And it's interesting to note that Kamala Harris, as a senator, was one of only 10 senators that opposed or voted against the USMCA. So obviously she has more progressive views on trade than President Biden would. To the extent that she has influence or impact on trade and economic policy with China is yet to be seen, but that's an X factor. Another X factor is the role of human rights. I mean, obviously, I think everyone would agree that it would certainly have a higher profile under a Biden administration than the current administration. But again, to what extent, what role, what influence it would have in determining and implementing U.S. trade policy and economic policy towards China would yet to be seen. So just a few observations on what a possible Biden administration would hold in terms of trade and economic policy in China moving, from this point forward. Appreciate your time and look forward to both Fangfei's and Jeremy's presentations and then our discussions. So thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you. And so now we turn to Fangfei Dong.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for Clay's introductions. So today I'm going to briefly talk about the trade policy under the second Trump administrations. As we know that when Trump got elected, lowering trade deficits with its key trading partners, especially China, was one of his key objectives on trade. In order to doing so, U.S. imposed various unilateral trade measures against China, such as imposed tariffs on $215 billion imported Chinese goods under the Section 301 investigations. And Section 232 investigation imposed steel and aluminum tariff. Section 201 tariff on solar panels. These unilateral actions are under the scrutiny of the global trading community, and it has also been challenged under the WTO. And a number of economists argue that behind the border barriers imposed by foreign governments, including China, prevent U.S. trade in goods as well as services from expanding to its full potential. The United States continues to eagerly renegotiate and negotiate trade agreements to lower those different trade barriers, including a trade deal with China. After 2 years and 19 rounds negotiations, U.S. and China finally reached on a phase 1 trade deals on January 15th this year. This initial trade deal was perceived as a first sign of de-escalation in the protracted U.S.-China trade war. This phase 1 trade agreement took initial step to addressing most controversial topics, including some beyond border barriers that hinder U.S. exports to Chinese market, such as agriculture-related regulations, and further opens financial services market in China. If Trump gets re-elected in his second terms, there's a good chance he will use phase 1 trade agreement as foundation to negotiate another trade deal, specifically deal with technology transfer issues, state-owned enterprises issues, industry subsidy issues, and currency manipulation issues. Those issues are very difficult to find a workable solutions that would be acceptable to the United States. Another trade tools that Trump administration utilized is expanded export control regime towards China. Recently, as China's response to those ongoing various friction in kind tit for tat, after the third time revision, and on the 22nd meeting of the Standing Committee of the 13th National People's Congress, voted and passed export control law on October 17th this year. It appears that this new export control law is modeled after U.S. export control regime. As a response to Chinese companies were increasingly penalized for violating U.S. export controls or designated for export restrictions in recent years. The Chinese government accelerated the development of an integrated export control regime. And another prog of Trump trade and investment policy is to put further restrictions on Chinese investment. And the U.S. also widening its scope of CFIUS reviews of China's investment in the United States. Those both actions have significantly cooled down the Chinese investment in the United States, which putting further restrictions on Chinese investment in the United States. China has also begun to pose some restrictions on U.S. investment in China. As we look ahead to a possible second Trump administration, it's likely that he will build upon all these existing initiatives and measures. However, we can see a slight shift from the Trump unilateral trade policy approach to a more regional approach to working with regional partners such as India and Australia, making sure these major partners are on the same page as the United States. Other initiatives to meeting the challenges arising from China include economic prosperity network plans were set up earlier this year with regional allies as well as the United States strategic approach to the PRC of China, in which the U.S. deems China as a competitive threat to the U.S. interests. To United States, other issues and concerns with China are geopolitical issues, cybersecurity issues, intellectual property right-related issues, and meeting of Phase 1 trade deal commitment issues, action counter One Belt, One Road initiatives. Chinese trade practices, including forced technology transfer issues, limited market access, intellectual property theft, and a subsidy to the state-owned enterprises. Trump argued that the unilateral tariff would shrink the U.S. trade deficits with China and cause companies to bring manufacturing jobs back to the United States. To Trump, as Brian mentioned before, the onshoring supply and production line is a more political strategy rather than based on pure consideration of economic principles. Trump administration believes that China is working to undermine U.S. alliances in the Indo-Pacific region. And according to Trump administration's view that the One Belt, One Road initiative is just an arrow in the China's quiver aimed at subverting American influence in that region. All these initiatives and steps are consistent with Trump administration's view that economic security is national security. So in summary, the second Trump administration will maintain and build upon its existing policies and measures at the same time. If Trump re-elected, he may still likely be emboldened to make new trade deals with China in order to establish his legacy as great deal maker. So these are some observations, and I'm looking forward to our discussions and questions later on. Thank you.
And thank you, Fangfei. That was terrific. We turn now to Jeremy.
Great, thank you, Clayton, and it's great to be back with the U.S China Institute. Terrific to be on this session with Brian and Fangfei. As I know, I'm a Los Angeles native, so go Dodgers, go Lakers. Great to be with a group from Los Angeles virtually, as I haven't been getting back much recently. My whole family's in Los Angeles. But I think, identify with certainly most of the comments that have been made previously by Brian and by Fangfei. I'll try to maybe take a step back and go a bit broader. I may repeat just a bit of what's been said, but I'll try to amend my remarks so that there's not too much repetition. But I really first want to start out by agreeing with Brian that, I think regardless of whether we have a second Trump term or a Biden administration, domestic issues are going to be the principal frame and in which a China policy is carried out. Perhaps some difference there with a second Trump term. But given COVID and related healthcare challenges, an economy on the brink, climate challenges, social upheaval, there's a burgeoning, what I would call run faster agenda and conversation in Washington and in the business community about, in government as well, of course, about the need for a technology strategy, the need for investment in infrastructure. China policy is going to fit in very much into that domestic agenda. And I think that domestic agenda very much comes first, given where we are as a country today. I think the international agenda and China will only come after. That doesn't mean a new administration will ignore China, but it will need, certainly if it's a Biden administration, you're talking about a transition, confirmations. We're talking about, at least a 6-month period as deputy secretaries and undersecretaries, assistant secretaries are nominated and ultimately confirmed, and a lot of internal strategy discussions and debates. And particularly if you have a new administration, a Biden administration, it's of course easy to talk about policy when you're on the campaign trail. But you don't really reconcile. You don't really plan. You don't really engage in that granular discussion of deciding on your vision, deciding on the strategy, the tactics, and then moving forward to execute until you're in office. And all that's going to take time, particularly if we have a Biden administration. A little bit different if you have a second Trump term. There'll be some measure of continuity, but even there, people will depart. Some will depart, some may stay, but there will be pretty significant changes, which may slow the pace of policymaking down as well. A second point. I think now more than ever, we do need a 360-degree view of the U.S. China relationship. It's a little bit of a truism, but there's just no getting around that security and economics increasingly overlap in the relationship, in our relationship with China, in the U.S. China relationship, but also for all countries around the world, driven by linkages between military capability and foundational and emerging technologies, cyber and the role of data. And of course, in the U.S. China relationship, when you have a situation when number one and number two are at perhaps best ferocious competitors, and some would say at worst in an adversarial posture on many fronts. And as we have seen with the pandemic, where supply chain resiliency matters a lot more, again, you're going to have this growing interface and set of concerns around the overlap of military, of security and economics. This is the only slide I'm going to show, and I think it is a useful frame as we think about where we are in the relationship today. And we can quibble with the sort of narratives on each side, but if you break out the relationship really into four buckets, you have the political military side of the relationship, the technology competition, the economic and commercial component of the relationship, and then the ideological component of the relationship that deals with values and systems values, our politics, issues like human rights. You can really see that we are at a point of really difficult challenges in all areas. And perhaps, if you were to put an arrow, if we were to use the arrows to, are we trending positively? Are we trending negatively? Or are we just holding steady? I think it's fair to say that we're probably, and Clayton, to your points at the opening, the arrows would probably be pointing downward, perhaps directly downward in all of these areas. So whoever comes in, and certainly this goes as well for the Chinese leadership, for President Xi and the Standing Committee and the party, this is going to be a very difficult management exercise on both sides to restore trust in the relationship. On the political military, some measure of trust, or I don't know, trust, maybe a more functional relationship is a better way to talk about it. On the political military side, obviously, there are some real challenges with regard to Taiwan. And those are both, we all know about those. Those are in the security and commercial dimensions. There's increasing discussion in policy circles about, the merits of continuing the policy of strategic ambiguity. Where do we go from the U.S.-Taiwan, the three communiques, U.S.-Taiwan Relations Act? Certainly this administration has moved the needle in a way that the Chinese government, the party, has not appreciated. There's growing talk of the need or the merits of upgrading the commercial relationship with Taiwan, perhaps in the form of something like a bilateral trade agreement. And how does that get navigated? Obviously, there's the challenges in the South China Sea and other parts of Asia Pacific. And then there's the Chinese policy of military-civil fusion, of course, which creates significant challenges in terms of how we work together in the technology space when there is a top-down strategy of fusing the civilian with the military, and of course the principal partners on the corporate side for American companies on the civil side. But when all this is sort of top-down being fused, and it's a sort of party dictated. It creates challenges in the areas of export controls, investment, and other areas. And I think you can say that, some of what the Congress did over the last 4 years, particularly in 2018 with overhauling CFIUS, the FIRMA, the Foreign Investment Risk and Review legislation, and also ECRA on export controls, was certainly a function of some of these kinds of policies. This, which feeds into technology competition, right? And some of that is about how to deal, and again, whether it's a Biden or a second Trump term, or a Biden administration, either one is going to have to figure out how to deal with Chinese competitiveness that is supercharged, right, that exists. China is more competitive today, first of all. China's done a lot of things right, investments in infrastructure, a very talented, skilled, capable highly educated workforce, investments in R&D and technology, but it's also competitiveness, China's competitiveness that exists with heavy state backing and support, and oftentimes in a highly protected cocoon. And of course, U.S. policymakers are now thinking about China's competitiveness in a new way, given that the U.S. does not have some of the offerings that China has. We don't have in the United States today a great fintech offering. Obviously, 5G has been written about ad nauseum, and how we allowed our advantages in telecom manufacturing and to sort of erode over a period of time, really going back to the Bush administration. A lot of challenges with regard to the Belt and Road Initiative, in particular the Digital Silk Road and China Standards 2035, and how China is promoting really BRI as an operating system on which so much technology deployment and procurement will be overlaid going forward in a variety of areas. And so new administration is going to have to figure out how to calibrate export controls to deal with some of these challenges, and so as not to do more damage than or more harm than good. And obviously, we have seen to some degree over the last 4 years actions which oftentimes were taken without consultation with the business community, where perhaps costs weren't weighed before the action was taken. And so, this is something I suspect there would be, and I'll get to this, that there would be greater deliberation perhaps on some of these issues in a Biden administration, but also with some potential downside that I'll talk more about. Obviously, on the technology competition side, we're also going to have to, again, either whoever wins is going to have to think through a data governance regime. And I think everyone would agree that there is an asymmetry, perhaps a gross asymmetry in access for tech platforms for cloud computing. I think, one of the reasons that WeChat is so much preferred as a means of communicating back to China is because so many other platforms have been outlawed by the party. You don't have Facebook or Twitter or other communications platforms because they're not allowed to operate in China, and that in part goes back to security measures, the cybersecurity law, the national security law, but even further it goes back to China kind of rewriting its WTO commitments back in the value-added telecom area, and in essence dumping those commitments or transforming those commitments to liberalize into its basic telecom category, which was a more restrictive category. One last point on the technology competition. This point goes beyond technology competition, but it's certainly relevant, and that is the growing extraterritoriality that we see in Chinese law. We see this in China's draft data regulations and laws. China has a new draft data law that's out that has a heavy extraterritorial component. Its new export control law, its IP, some of the actions that are being taken now by the Supreme People's Court vis-a-vis a German company, Conversant, and a U.S. company, InterDigital, raise a whole series of extraterritorial challenges as companies seek not only to compete in China, but also to be compensated or to be able to seek legal redress in jurisdictions outside of China when they're not when there's unfair competition or other violations of law. Third bucket, economic and commercial. There's already been a fair amount of discussion about this. How to build on phase one, how to keep the gains from phase one, but also move on to what's often been termed as phase two. And really, I think the issues that have long been of highest priority, the subsidy issues, a range of forced tech transfer issues that were not addressed, the digital issues, treatment of data, market access for cloud computing, standard setting, and so forth. So, and finally, ideological. These issues clearly have come to the fore. I think it's fair to say that to a fairly significant degree, Chinese policies in a variety of areas are making it more and more difficult for numerous stakeholders to stay true to their core values while preserving their brands and access and relationships in the China market. And that's something that, whether it's a second Trump administration or a Biden administration, will have to navigate. I think on a second Trump term, we've seen, I think, sort of two approaches. In the first in this administration, we've seen a phase one, sort of a more transactional approach, but the approach that led to the phase one deal. And then we've also seen, the consulate closures, the journalists, the entity listing of numerous companies. So I think we'd probably see a mix of that in the Trump administration. I think we'd see a mix of that in a Biden administration. But I think Brian I would agree with a lot of what Brian said in terms of, if we have a Biden administration, you would see greater emphasis on the policymaking process, perhaps more focus on cost-benefit analysis of certain actions. You'd see that manifest in the context of export control policy, investment policy, perhaps data policies. I think you would see in a Biden administration a return to more regular dialogue and reliance on the sort of usual tools of or customary tools of diplomacy. I think you would see a greater emphasis on allied cooperation. Although I think when the history books are written on the Trump administration, I think you'll see that actually the Trump administration did quite a bit to work with allies in the security space, perhaps less so in the economic and commercial space, but quite a bit in the security space. I would differ a little bit from Brian. Brian placed a lot, sort of how to put forward a vision of a Biden administration really relying on the WTO. And I think actually vis-a-vis China, the focus would be far more on plurilateral institutions and plurilateral agreements to deal with China rather than the WTO. The WTO, I think, is very important. It forms it has long been a great baseline. It's absolutely essential that we bolster it, we reform it. But I think it's hard to see how the WTO provides the answers for the 21st century suite of issues that we're confronted that China is presenting. And in fact, I would expect this allied cooperation to come first in a Biden administration, probably before a significant dose of bilateral engagement. So I think as you think about a Biden administration that may at some point want to scale back some of those tariffs, I think there is this question about, well, what leverage do you replace the tariffs with? How do you get outcomes with China that are beneficial to U.S. interests? And I think the answer lies in having an allied approach, and you're going to have to do that probably first before you really spend a lot of time on the bilateral side. I do agree. Also, you'd have more efforts to find positive sum cooperation, but probably not something that resembles the return to the Obama administration, where you had this transactional approach of sort of compromises, tied to progress on global issues and sort of giving China a pass on some other bilateral issues. I think you'd see cooperation on the merits that's less transactional. Let me just, a couple of closing comments. First, I think, if we look, to a Biden administration, there are some serious challenges that need to be considered. An overemphasis on process can lead to stasis and lowest common denominator outcomes. So how decision-making works in a Biden administration will be critical. In that regard, personalities matter a lot. And they, of course, would matter a lot in a second Trump term. Who fills key slots will be really important. Dialogue. I think there would be a return to more dialogue, but how do you avoid dialogue for dialogue's sake and getting wrapped up in dialogues as the outcome? Allied cooperation, really difficult. It's not easy. Can we align with the Europeans and the Japanese on some really difficult policy challenges where we seem to be drifting further apart, not growing closer together? Digital, subsidies, competition policy, procurement, investment policy. Investment policy, perhaps we've come a little bit closer together, but export controls. These are not this is not necessarily a trade expanding agenda. It's arguably a trade restrictive agenda. And finally, I think as we saw in the Obama administration, positive sum cooperation isn't easy, even in areas like clean energy. There were challenges related to IP and so forth. So I think you'd see that emphasis on the merits, but it's also not easy. Two last comments. Congress and the public. We haven't talked about Congress. Happy to talk about it in the Q&A, but in many respects, Congress is ahead of the executive branch. You see a lot of legislative proposals, a lot of bipartisan concern. We are more in a space of the days of NTR, of annual reviews of China's trading status in terms of how the Congress is approaching and thinking about China than we are. We've kind of moved backward in that sense. And so there's a lot of concern, a lot of activity, and I don't expect that to dissipate. There is a question, if we have a Biden administration, how much space will Congress, particularly if the Democrats win both the Senate and the House, if they sweep, how much space will would a majority leader Schumer and House Speaker Pelosi, if she gets another term, provide a Biden administration to execute policy? And then a final thought, just as we look ahead in terms of where we're headed and where China's headed. 2021, 2022, big years, 100th anniversary of the party. You have the centennial anniversary, July 1, 2021. The Winter Olympics, February 4th through 20th, 2022. And then the 20th Party Congress, where I think there's an expectation that President Xi will be will be on the ballot for another term in the fall of 2022. So I think calendar, that's a really interesting thing for us all to consider as we think about the future of U.S. China relations. And with that, turn it back to you, Clayton.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. That was a real tour de force trip through just how complicated U.S. China relations are. And you mentioned, of course, the calendar. As it happens today in Beijing, the party met, the Central Committee met, and presumably came up with this Vision 2035 statement with outlining goals for the next 15 years. And they, are putting together the next 5-year plan, all of those sorts of things. None of us know exactly where the future is going to take us, either in 5 days with the U.S. election or, what's going to happen necessarily in China and between the two countries. But let me start with a question for all three of you. I've got a couple questions for you, and then we're going to go to the questions that have been submitted by our pretty smart audience. We've got a lot of good comments and questions coming in. But my first question is on the tech front. In many ways, the competition between the United States and China is in this tech sector, broadly defined. And at the outset, it looked like the trade war was really going to be a tech war. Although the president was always focused on, trade in goods as opposed to some of these other considerations or services. Let's talk a little bit about tech decoupling. we are quite joint. The two countries collaborate, quite closely in the manufacture of the highest tech, highest caliber products. And both sides rely on the other as potential markets for these things. And yet we are seeing a tech decoupling through various, the entity list, not providing Huawei with newer chips, these kinds of issues. So if I could ask the three of you to talk about tech decoupling, both to what extent is it inevitable because of the security concerns that Jeremy mentioned? To what extent might it be desirable to build in resiliency in these supply chains? And to what extent would it be an utter disaster? So let's perhaps start with Brian on this front.
Sure, thanks, Clay. Great question. I think I think you would see things differently depending on who the next administration would be in terms of where the policy would go. Through the three of us, I think you could get a clear idea there'd be quite a different approach between the two possible presidents. But the complete decoupling, I think, although maybe ideologically might be a desire, I think in reality would be extremely difficult and extremely costly. Just take a simple example. If indeed it were to go decouple, let's say 5G technology, you'd have basically two global standards. You'd have Huawei standard, and you'd have a Western or U.S. led standard. And just the cost involved of building two different systems of manufacturers, supply chains, and stuff like that would be devastating, I think, and very difficult to manage. So I think a complete decoupling is realistically not practical or possible. But I think depending on who would be president, you'd certainly see different approaches in trying to advance as much decoupling or independence as possible. As I mentioned in my remarks, under a Biden administration, you would likely see a multilateral approach where he says you work together to set standards and rules to govern areas such as 5G or AI, which is in desperate need of some standards and rules. So that would be how I'd see it.
That's terrific. Fangfei, do you have some thoughts on this?
I think she has to unmute.
Okay. So I want to talk about these questions based on the supply chain aspect. And as we know that right now the world and economy and especially manufacturers, they're deeply integrated with each other. And it's really, really hard to decoupling, specifically or really have a clean cut regards to is a decoupling of the technology. Although the United States and the China has a severe competition in these areas, and also the rest of the world, they are trying to find to stand behind which country. Just for example, like India right now have a really close alliances with the United States, especially right now we can see the last year they had an agreement specifically in dealing with how the cooperation on technology. And also another observation is we can also see that regionalization of the FTA. Yes, you can refuse to import or use some parts from certain country produced, but you cannot stop your trading partners what they are using. And in the end, those products and the final products is produced in your country. Then how you explain that and how you're going to avoid that is impossible. So you cannot avoid competitions, but you can try your best to trying to do decoupling. So that is my observation.
Yeah, thank you. And Jeremy, you raised the question about the security concerns and to what extent might tech decoupling be driven by that. You mentioned CFIUS, the committee that reviews investment in the United States, that sort of thing. And we've talked too about relatively closed tech markets in China, access on the services side, platform side, these kinds of things. Where do you see this headed?
Yeah, so it's a great question. It's the question of certainly of the day, if not the century, or the next half century, I think. And let me start by saying, look, I think China is a critical market for so many American companies, including tech companies. both as an investment market, as a tremendous resource of human talent. When you look at the number of engineers that China has, and the commitment to education. And that market, the China market, is critical for economies of scale. It's critical for R&D back home. It's critical for jobs and growth in the United States. And so, all of that is a fact of life. At the same time, there are legitimate, I think, to deny that there are not serious security concerns, national security concerns, is ridiculous. We should be very forthright about those. And we should also, I think, be clear that China's industrial policy, that policies like indigenous innovation, policies like the multi-level protection scheme, the national security law, the cybersecurity law, and on, the support for the chip industry, those did not start as a reaction to the Trump administration. Those policies long predate. Okay, it was indigenous innovation in 2009, 2010, and strategic emerging industries and the 13th five-year plan. It was then made in China 2025, the AI plan, and so on and so forth, right? So in many respects, I think it is fair to say that, and military civil fusion, many of the Trump administration's policies were in fact in some regard, a response, I think, to those policies, and where there was bipartisan, if you talk to people at the end of the Obama administration, there was very much, you talk to them privately, a very similar worldview. I think the key is, what is really important? How do you, we can't have a world where national security is everything, is all encompassing, and because that leaves no space for commerce, that leaves no space for what fuels our economies and provides us with livelihoods and so forth. So it's I think the goal is to create perhaps the express high walls around small gardens, kind of, right? I think that's been the approach in the U.S. export control system. I think an investment policy for quite some time. Now that balance is now shifting. The question really is how far does it shift? And I would say that China has a lot to do. I mean, obviously we know, I think, as Americans, we differ sometimes, but I think we know what our principles are. We know we prefer markets over makers. We're not big fans at this point of industrial policy, even as we have a history of industrial policy in this country, which we should not deny. And so, I think it's an iterative process. I think and decoupling is something that we are looking at very closely, because we think it's really important that policymakers understand the costs of their policy choices. And so, we're coming to conclusion on a report in this area. We're looking at the macro data. We're also looking at 3 sectors. And I can tell you that, when you think about a sort of modest decoupling, a hard decoupling, and a full decoupling, as you go through those various scenarios, the costs go up. They go way up. They are, without revealing the study results, they're astronomical. And so policymakers need to get it right. But that's going to take also China, which is pursuing, if you look at what came out today, since you mentioned it, China's very focused on control. It's very focused on not only dual circulation, but inner circulation, right? Which is part of what was announced today. And so it takes 2. It's going to take 2, and this is where and the United States, the American business community, we're not alone in these concerns. These concerns are present in Europe and growing in Europe. They are in Japan. They are in Korea. They are pervasive, and so. This is something that will be worked on, but we should not move to hard decoupling or full decoupling. But we have to work through some of these issues so there's some balance. And in the technology, I'll just one final comment. We would, in my view, not be having these discussions about TikTok today. I think WeChat is another issue, but TikTok, had China, as part of the phase one deal, opened its cloud computing market. And so that there was some parity, right? There was that our platforms had access. I don't think we'd be having the kind of discussion that we're having about TikTok. Some of those concerns around TikTok are born out of, I think what's fair to say has been 20 years of digital, at least 20 years of digital mercantilism in China.
Yeah, well, this is a key point. And when you talk about decoupling, how far down does that go? You might be just talking about products, but are you talking about, here at USC, are you talking about access to the education tied to these technologies? There's a lot, of course, for us to consider.
Well, yeah, I was just, when you get into, yes, and there are many other aspects of decoupling, and we look at some of those as well, and we've seen, regrettably, lots of decoupling in those areas as well, which is real cause for concern. But there are also issues. There are also challenges with regard to espionage and other, challenges that need to be worked through in those spaces.
Let me ask one more question, and then we'll go to questions from the audience. Jeremy raised the point about it doesn't all happen from the executive branch. You might change the president and vice president, but there are other players. There is a public that more and more looks to China as a source of trouble, a source of challenge, that sort of thing. And you have a Congress that has never stopped having opinions about these matters and putting forward legislation. And so let me ask this question. Before you can even begin to build alliances in Europe, alliances with partners in Asia, don't we need a better alliance within the United States? And maybe you could say something about the potential for, whatever the next administration is, to work more comprehensively and coherently with both the Congress, the business community, and the wider public. And so, this is a little bit of a poli-sci question as opposed to a legal question or a procedural one. But Brian, what do you think?
Well, I think you're right. I mean, Congress is going to have a huge role in any future administration's trade and economic policy towards China. And if there's one issue in the current Congress where there's so much, acrimony and lack of bipartisanship, the one issue that brings the two parties together for the most part is China. I mean, both sides agree that we need to be a lot tougher on them. We need to address the challenges and concerns that have risen, whether it's technology, whether it's trade, whether it's, down the road decoupling, everything like that. I think, there needs to be a better relationship between Congress and China, Congress and China, but also Congress and whoever is president. A couple of things. Again, we see if Trump is reelected and the Republicans lose control of the Senate, it's going to be a very difficult way because so much, water's gone under the bridge between Trump and the Democrats in both houses. It's going to be very difficult to rebuild that relationship. And I hope that doesn't happen in that scenario. But if Biden is reelected, I think the former USTR, Robert Zelk, wrote a recent article saying that no one since Lyndon Johnson has had more experience with Congress than Biden, being, of course, over 36 years in the Senate, worked very closely with the Congress in the as vice president or President Obama. And so I think even if the Republicans maintain a majority in the Senate after this next election, I think there's a better chance, and just in general of the approach of a more bipartisan, multilateral approach, I think would better in terms of trying to, coordinate better policy coordination and development between Congress and the president of the Biden administration.
Now, thank you for that. And Fangfei, I'm going to come back to you in just a second, and I'd like for you to be thinking about the China side of this equation. Who are the players besides Xi Jinping and the Politburo who are part of this discussion? So let me go to Jeremy on the American side, and then we'll come back to Fangfei.
So again, another really good question, Clayton. I think first, look, Congress is going to play a critical role on, on the so-called run faster agenda, right? So, it's always better in terms of how we deal with any country in the world. If we are strong domestically, if we are tending to our own house, right? And we have a strong economy, we have strong fundamentals. If, we are doing what we need to do, we have good infrastructure, we're investing for the future, we're going to be, and sound policies, we're going to be in a better position. Now, there is this burgeoning discussion about, what does that run faster agenda look like? I think there is, we at the chamber, again, we don't like we're not big fans of industrial policy. But I think there's also an understanding that government is going to play a role, that there is a need for more investment in basic R&D, that we need to align incentives, and there has to be some funding there to match, right? You can't incentivize people with just words on a piece of paper. And so Congress has a critical role to play there. I think, and Congress is going to, just like it did with FIRMA and it did with ECRA, it's going to have a critical role on digital policy, on competition policy, on a whole range of issues that will play a critical role going forward in how we approach our international agenda, not just with China, but with others as well, right? I mean, and the Biden. I think it was Brian, you noted that, the Biden trade policy, with a heavy emphasis on Buy America, right, and sort of domestic investment and procurement, preferential procurement arrangements and so forth. That's not really what multilateralism or trade agreements have been built on. And on some level, it's almost antithetical to what the trade agenda has long been. And so, all these issues are going to need to be worked through with and that's where you're going to need the administration and the Congress really to work together to think through what is the mission, what is the strategy, and it's not going to be easy. And everyone around the world, including China, is going to be watching really closely in terms of if we do have a Biden administration, which we don't know. And then I think even a Trump administration, they're going to have to turn at some point to working with allies if they want to make progress with China. I think that,
Yeah, and obviously, there are a lot of unknowns in this. And Fangfei, you are unique on this panel because you have actually worked inside the Chinese bureaucracy to get things certified, to get approvals, to make it possible for businesses to be able to sell things within China, and dealing with safety hurdles, these kinds of things. So you have an understanding of the bureaucracy maybe that's stronger than the rest of us. I was wondering if you could say something about the forces helping to shape policy in China, because obviously, a policy towards China is one thing, but a Chinese policy towards the United States might be quite another. And maybe you can help us understand how the Chinese government sees the stakes. We know from today's the reporting on the Central Committee meeting, the plenum, that the emphasis is going on self-reliance, on saying we have to be secure, technologically and these kinds of things. We're going to focus on our own market to a greater extent.
Thank you, Clay, for your remarks and observations with regards to China's situation right now. So unlike the United States, China has a very unique political systems. And also a lot of people criticize that China's like a state-run economy and also as well as the industry subsidy issues. Those two issues are under the scrutiny and under the WTO as well as a lot of like a Western economy. So first of all, I think a lot of people, they really don't know what how the Chinese economies are running, and then it's not like a Chinese government wants to trying to doing so, because unlike the Western society, neither United States or Western countries, every your government branches and executive branches, they're built on the traditional Western philosophy system. But then political philosophy theory, unlike the China, is very different. The China's way is their unique. They tried on their own ways. You cannot find another countries like the China has a way right now to pace its road in the future or currently. And in regards to what's the influence or impact on Chinese policymakers to making their domestic policy or foreign policies, unlike the United States, as you mentioned before, there is no consistency and also the lack of collaboration within the executive branch. But to China, it's more simple. It's one government and one party. And the relationship between the government and the party is really hard to define or separate. But then we don't have other executive branches issues or problems to deal with inconsistency or collaboration, cooperative issues. But the problems that China dealing with industry structure issues, as well as uneven economic development issues between the East and the West and the North and the South. So it's very critical issues for the government to dealing with this. And unlike the United States and also other Western economies, uneven development issues is not that significant compared with China. Although the Chinese GDP is very significant high right now, but if you go to the western part of China, it's another different world. So how you addressing this? And unemployment issues is unlike the Western countries. There are very different ways to handle this. So that's why the state-owned enterprises exist, because that's a main resource to deal with employment problems. And also the impact for the policies of the domestic China, either from the government or party itself. So right now, it's more from the pressures from the global community, because unlike recent years, China never, I think it's not never, it's just in the recent 10 years at least, it didn't never face any a really strong and challenges from outside. Unlike right now, EU as well as the United States, and trying to see the Australia, they are forced to choose which side to pick. And another small or medium-sized developed countries, they're stuck in between. It's really hard to deal with the issues that right now is the confliction between the United States and China. So from my perspective of view, that China, the policy making, they're driven by two forces. One is domestic economy, and trying to even the economy. And also from the outsiders, outside of China, it's more based on the consideration, how better engage in this global community, global trading community, and to let the Chinese products and the Chinese services and to better engage in this global economy. So that is my thinking.
Thank you for that. There obviously are politics within China, and the state-owned enterprises have not been the engine for growth. The engine for growth has come in the private sector, and yet the state-owned enterprises are the key instrument of control and trying to advance the kinds of policies that you were just talking about, building out the infrastructure, trying to improve living standards in the West, as well as, of course, with the Belt and Road Initiative. So there's a lot for us to wrestle with. And there's tensions within, and we know, that although it's a unitary state in the sense of the party controls the government and is top to bottom linked in this way, we know that, the folks above have policies, the folks below have countermeasures. If you want us to control pollution, we'll just turn off the factory until the night. And go in that direction. We've got quite a few questions. Some of them involve the World Trade Organization, as well as multilateral, trade organizations, those kinds of things. And so that would be a good subject. Many of you raised the question of this. Can the WTO function today? Is it broken? It was certainly created for a world that's a little bit different from the world that we live in. It's before, of course, a lot of the tech expansion. It's before a lot of these other considerations. Is WTO broken? Can it perform any kind of referee role? Or is it just hampered because of the current administration's policy towards it? Brian, what do you think?
Well, thanks, Kai. I think, again, another great question on that, and an issue that's near and dear to my heart. So I would say it's not broken, but it's limping very badly. And I think in a large part of that, there are structural and institutional challenges that need to be met. You're right, it needs to be updated and modernized. But I think a lot of its problems, and especially one of its key roles, and that is to be, to be the overseer or the regulator of ensuring compliance with international global trade rules by its members, is been shut down basically because of the Trump administration's refusal to to consider candidates for the appellate body judges. So I think, with a new administration that is more supportive and reinserts U.S. leadership would go a long way in revitalizing the WTO. I think it's at a critical juncture. I agree with that. They're going to get a new director general, hopefully soon. And it looks like it will be the candidate from Nigeria, which would be very interesting, bringing a breath of fresh air, so to speak. They have been making significant progress in the various initiatives for rules on digital trade. That is very expansive, everything from privacy to standards and so forth like that, data localization, those kind of issues. They're making significant progress on issues like such as agricultural subsidies, which have been a major burden on the free trading system around the world. So I think with a new administration, and maybe the new Trump administration, even if I'm being overly optimistic, given his disdain for the WTO, but might see the benefits of having that organization. The other thing I think is important about the WTO, and again, I know Jeremy and I see a little bit differently on this, but where the Biden administration would put a little more faith or utilization of the WTO is that China, among many other things, as Trump administration has pulled back U.S. leadership in so many areas, including the WTO and global trade. If you've noticed, China has come out very vociferously saying we're taking the mantle of champions of free trade and the rules-based multilateral system. And yet we all know that current WTO rules have been flouted by the Chinese system. And so I think the Biden administration would be smart in going back to the WTO and say, hey, China, call your card here. Is that you're saying you're the guardian of the multilateral trading system, then abide by the rules and support the WTO and its enforcement of its trade rules. So I think, as I say, it's not dead, it's limping badly, but I think it could be could be effectively revitalized with new leadership, both in terms of the new DG, the advances in these various initiatives and new areas that will modernize the trade rules for the 21st century, and reinserted U.S. leadership.
Thank you. And 20 years ago, China made structural changes in order to gain approval to enter the World Trade Organization. Absent that big carrot, what might make it in China's interest to do that? Certainly, China has benefited from globalization, has benefited from having a stable trading environment, those sorts of things. Now, Fangfei, you and Brian have made presentations at the World Trade Organization, and you've also met with trade officials from other countries. What do you think about revitalizing and using the WTO to foster the kinds of changes that both sides might want?
Brian, you want to talk first? Or
you could go ahead, but you could mention maybe how we use the WTO forum as a way to revitalize the organization in terms of creating new rules for new areas, for example, like competition policy.
Okay, so I want to address for 3 points here. The first of all, at the beginning, like the countries, the trade clubs, which is original WTO members, they're trying to invite and accepted the Chinas to get into the WTO based on the good premises that is based on the U.S. leadership, like the German and the Japan going to through those liberalize the trade and to change their industrial economy and the political structure into a more democratized ways. But after years, it seems it's unlikely happen, because if it happened, the things won't happen right now. There's a trade wars between China and the United States, and there's no a harsh scrutiny from the other part of the world towards China with the Chinese conduct. This is the first thing I want to mention first is about the originally premises why they want to invite China to the WTO, and the second is to addressing the WTO as a broad. I would say it may be updated. The policy and the laws, they cannot really keep update with what the changing world as technology, as an economy, how fast it is. So when you change and adapt those change, there also the policy and the laws, they need their own time to doing so. For example, the WTO needs the reform. And Brian and I, we're writing articles about the WTO reform on the upcoming foreign affairs journals. We're mentioning about this. Without the WTO, so how the global economy gonna to work better with each other, especially through the trade? Because current WTO policy or rules, they're not the one size fits all policy. We need different agreements, such as like a trade facilitation agreement, technology cooperations, and all those different issues. They need like the central organization to help and coordinate these things and globally. And for example, the illegal fishery issues, as well as e-commerce issues, the digital trade. There's no really updated version of the agreement there to help the other countries or different economies to better to do business with each other. What's the premises of the WTO is to lower the trade barriers, expanding the market access for the rest of the world. If without WTO, what's going to happen? The tariffs, the different like a non-tariff barriers, like a technical barriers there, and then different standards, and then there's a huge barriers on the trade, and then how going to continue to increasing the global prosperities. And the third is about our competition policy, our proposal last year at the WTO, and we're calling for like there's a multilateral agreement on the certain issues and to lower the trade barriers in the specific subjects. So that is what we're wishing in the future. What is the trade going to be like, and how the WTO is to be like, and how to better facilitate the global trade and economy.
That's terrific. Thank you. And so now I was already waiting for Jeremy's Centers report. He's already got me on the hook for that. Now I need to wait for this foreign affairs article on the WTO.
Can I just make a quick comment here on the WTO? I know I'll be very quick. U.S. Chamber of Commerce, we are huge supporters of the WTO. It's critical. It is a framework that has allowed global trade and prosperity to rise to unprecedented levels, unprecedented heights. But I think first we have to be true to history here. It was the Obama administration and Ambassador Froman who began the process of starving the appellate body. This was not a problem that, in fact, the Trump administration diagnosed with regard to the behavior or the decision making of the appellate body. It was something that the Obama administration diagnosed. So I think point number two, in terms of, since we're talking about China and is the WTO the solution to China, certainly, Clayton, you point out that China has professed its leadership of global institutions, including the WTO. But look, it'd be great if China was moving to cut subsidies, moving to open its markets, including in the digital space, pursuing a competition policy that was about markets over makers, and on and on and on. I think we could have a really great conversation. It would be even better conversation if the Europeans were moving in that direction. As we look at European digital subsidies, the European Cloud Project, significant discrimination across the board in the digital space. And so I just think, I think the WTO is critical. It has to be updated, but we have to be appropriately sober, given the set of circumstances we're dealing with in China, but also Europe. And we'll have to see how it all comes, what kinds of policies a second Trump term pursues, or a Biden administration together with the Congress. So I think we really need to I think sobriety is the order of the day while supporting the WTO.
Now, thank you very much for that. Now, rhetoric is not enough, right? Saying that you recognize that you've benefited from globalization, that you want globalization, and actually engineering the structural reforms are two separate things. And, I think we need to be upfront about that. I have two unfair questions now, and this is where we'll close it off. And so you can choose to answer either or both of these unfair questions. I have to ask, though, that each of you restrict yourself to 60 seconds. Okay? So the two unfair questions, maybe the ones before were unfair too, but in any case, several people have asked for personnel. Who's going to be in these places? Because personnel can shape policy, right? Sometimes who you choose defines what you've chosen, right? What direction you're going to go. So first question, any comments about, who might be in key positions? And then secondarily, and even more after Jeremy's point about sobriety, should we be at all optimistic, or are we looking at an extraordinarily difficult relationship that's not going to be easily sorted out regardless of who occupies the White House? And so, Brian, you started us off to begin with. Again, each of you has 60 seconds. You can take the personnel question, the optimism question, or you could use your 60 seconds as you choose.
Okay, thank you very much, Clay. And the questions are reasonable. So I'll take the second one first and see how much time I have left for the first one. So on the second one, I think no matter which administration it takes the office the next term, it's going to be a very challenging and difficult relationship. And I think it's going to be that way for a while. I also see a certain amount of optimism even under both scenarios. I think I'm more optimistic under the Biden administration for the reasons I mentioned, a more multilateral approach. We need to work together with our partners and take a united front against these unfair. And I think I think he would work better with Congress, which is, again, as we've all mentioned, is a key component. But I think the Trump administration, the second administration, as Fangfei mentioned, I think he would be emboldened by being reelected. And he wants to, historically, presidents have wanted to cement their foreign policy legacy in their second term. So he might become a little more willing to reach a deal that could help bridge the gaps and start a road to recovery, if you will.
Okay, so 5 seconds if you choose to use it.
Biden, because he's a long career politician and a government official, is at least now doing his campaign is relying on long-term aides from his position as Senate, Foreign Relations Committee leader, and of course as vice president. So I think at least initially, for transition purposes, he would rely on those long-term advisors in both economy and trade.
Okay, thank you. Fangfei, 60 seconds.
Okay, so I want to make a comments in democracy itself, because at the beginning of the year, as we see, that's why the trade confliction happened, as well as different election, different nationalism leaders and populist leaders all over the world, and it's causing different frictions of the problems in global trade as well as international relations. So it's no matter who's going to be elected in the next term to the United States. The problem is where we should be at now. We have to deal with a trend that is a whole globally the common issues we're facing. That is the trend. It's not like after World War II, like countries work together and for a common goal, rather than the country begin to work themselves and to find the better interest. And how we're going to balance those interests is a thing we're going to consider to further consider about, and that going to made the administration to think and to shape their more consistency policies, foreign policies.
Thank you. That's terrific. Jeremy, 60 seconds.
So on the relationship, I think it's going to it's going to be a challenging relationship, for some time to come. So I would agree with Brian. I think that doesn't mean we can't continue to cooperate in areas. It doesn't mean there won't be an enormous amount of business that gets done every day as it does today. But there are going to be a lot of challenges that are going to require, if the U.S. China relationship has always been a relationship that requires careful management. Going back to the days of President Nixon and the opening and Dr. Kissinger and others, those early pioneers. And there's always been a need to carefully manage points of friction in the relationship. And that's never been more true than today. And it's, of course, with technology and sort of China now where it is and global trends, as Fangfei just mentioned, it's going to be challenging. So I think we just need to, we need to work together where, we must have a functional relationship. We must continue to trade and conduct commerce, but there's going to be challenges, regardless of if it's a Trump second term or a Biden administration. And then on the personnel, look, there's just I'm not a Biden insider, so I don't. You have what you read about in the press. There's I think Elizabeth Warren today declared, or there's press suggesting she's going to make her pitch for Treasury Secretary. Obviously, Lael Brainerd is under consideration in that, perhaps, as Sarah Bloom Raskin and other. I think there are big questions about who will be the USTR. Is the USTR going to be a pro sort of trade sort of USTR in the mold that we've had for many years, or is the USTR going to be more from the progressive wing of the Democrat? I think we don't know the answer to that question. I don't know if the vice president knows who he put in that slot on foreign policy. We know he's got a circle of advisors led by Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan and Tom Donilon is there, and Susan Rice, of course, and Bill Burns and others like. So, all those folks are going to, whether they're in or out, they will be, important advisors to a Biden administration if should he win. And of course, the Chinese know them all pretty well. Many of these folks are known commodities. So, Chris Coons, another one, Senator Coons, who is close to the vice president, who, based on what we read, it sounds like he'd also like to be Secretary of State. So we'll see. We'll see how this is venturing into Pekingology, right? White Houseology, or I don't know what we call it, but let's see what happens next week.
That's right. Guessing, based on the photo opportunities.
And I think, let me just say, it's also interesting to consider who would be in cabinet. And it's equally interesting, not more interesting, to think about who would be in a second cabinet in a second Trump term. So, we can talk about that as well, but if we had more time for the next conversation. Thank
you all for trying to deal with these various puzzles. Trying to unpack where we are, where we might be going, depending on which candidate wins. You have definitely illuminated key issues and highlighted some of the possibilities. I have two requests for our audience. And the first of those requests is sometime probably tomorrow, we will post the video of today's conversation on our website. And at that time, we would really appreciate it if you would share a link to that video with your colleagues, with your friends who might similarly be interested in America's policy, economic policy towards China. So that's the first request. The second request is make sure you are a subscriber to our newsletter. In recent weeks, our newsletter has offered some very interesting charts about trade patterns, about China's openness, America's openness to foreign direct investment, these kinds of things. We want to continue to bring sources, and we can do that if you are a subscriber. So please do subscribe to the newsletter, go to the website, china.usc.edu, click on that subscribe button. I want to thank our three presenters today. You have prepared well for all kinds of uncertainty, and we really appreciate the education that you've provided. And we thank everybody who's carved out time to be with us. Best wishes, everyone. Take care.
Clay, thank you very much.
Thank you.